Thanks, Claudia. It seems to me that these days poetry is read mainly by other poets and academics. And that's one of the reasons I chose to talk about Dylan Thomas. When I lived in the UK, everyone knew him and his work and could quote at least some of it. Factory workers, shop assistants, certainly all students, whether they studied engineering or English or physics, they could quote Dylan Thomas. On the day he died, the whole country was in mourning, and the BBC broadcast his poetry all day long. It was a national tragedy, and it's hard to think of a poet now in Canada that would have that effect.
Leonard Cohen.
Maybe, yeah. Dylan Thomas was born at 5 Codonkin Drive in the Uplands area of Swansea on the 27th of October 1914. His father, David John Thomas, was an English master who taught English literature at the local grammar school. His mother, Florence Hannah Thomas, was a seamstress born in Swansea. Nancy, Thomas' sister, was 9 years older than he. Their father brought up both children to speak English only, even though both parents knew Welsh, and his father was known to give Welsh lessons in the home. His childhood was spent largely in Swansea, with regular summer trips to visit his maternal aunts on their Carmarthenshire farms. These rural sojourns and the contrast with town life of Swansea provided inspiration for much of his work, notably many short stories, radio essays, and the poem Fern Hill. Thomas was known to be a sickly child who shied away from school and preferred reading on his own, and was considered too frail to fight in World War II, instead serving the war effort by writing scripts for the government. He suffered from bronchitis and asthma. Thomas's formal education began at Mrs. Hall's Dame School, a private school which was situated a few streets away. He described it in quite early one morning. "Never was there such a dame school as ours, so firm and kind and smelling of galoshes, with sweet and fumbled music of the piano lessons drifting down from upstairs to the lonely schoolroom, where only the sometimes tearful wicked sat over undone sums, or to repent a little crime, the pulling of a girl's hair during geography, the sly shin kick under the table during English." In October 1925, Thomas attended the all-boys Swansea Grammar School. Thomas's first poem was published in the school magazine. He later became its editor. He left school at 16 to become a reporter for the local newspaper, the South Wales Daily Post, only to leave the job under duress, doesn't say what kind, 18 months later. He then joined an amateur dramatic group in Mumbles, which is an area of Swansea, but still continued to work as a freelance journalist for a few more years. Thomas spent his time visiting the cinema in the Uplands, walking along Swansea Bay, visiting a theatre where he used to perform, and frequenting Swansea's pubs. He especially patronised those in the Mumbles areas, such as the Antelope and the Mermaid. A short walk from the local newspaper where he worked was the Cardoma Cafe in Castle Street. At the cafe, he met with various contemporary artists, such as his good friend and poet Vernon Watkins. These writers, musicians, and artists became known as the Cardoma Gang. In 1932, Thomas embarked on what would be one of his various visits to London. It's often commented that Thomas was indulged like a child, and he was. In fact, still a teenager when he published many of the poems he would become famous for. "And death shall have no dominion, before I knocked, and the force that through the green fuse drives the flower." He saw his work in The Listener in 1934 and caught the attention of two of the most senior poets of the day, T.S. Eliot and Stephen Spender. His highly acclaimed first poetry volume, 18 Poems, was published on the 18th of December 1934 and went on to win a contest run by the Sunday Referee netting him new admirers from the London poetry world, including Edith Sitwell. His passionate musical lyricism caused a sensation in those years of desiccated modernism. The critic Desmond Hawkins said, "It was the sort of bomb that bursts no more than once in 3 years." In all, he wrote half his poems while still living at 5 Quantin Drive before he moved to London. And it was also the time that Thomas's reputation for heavy drinking developed. In the spring of 1936, Dylan Thomas met the dancer Caitlin McNamara in the Wheatsheaf pub. They were introduced by Augustus John, the artist, who was McNamara's lover at the time, and there were rumours that she continued her relationship with him after she married Thomas. A drunken Thomas proposed to McNamara on the spot, and the two began a courtship. In 1937, he married McNamara in a registry office in Penzance, Cornwall, and in 1938, the couple rented a house in the village of Lochern in West Wales. In the next few years, they had 3 children. At the outset of the Second World War, Thomas was designated C3, which meant that although he could, in theory, be called up for service, he would be in one of the last groups to be so. He was saddened to see his friends enter active service, leaving him behind, and drank while struggling to support his family. He wrote to the director of the films division of the Ministry of Information asking for employment, but after a rebuff, he eventually ended up working for Strand Films. And he wrote the film scripts for at least 5 films while he was there. The publication of Deaths and Entrances in 1946 was a major turning point for Thomas. The critic W.J. Turner commented in The Spectator, "This book alone, in my opinion, ranks him as a major point." Thomas was well known for being a versatile and dynamic speaker, best known for his poetry readings. His powerful voice would captivate American audiences during his speaking tours of the early 1950s, and he made over 200 broadcasts for the BBC. And I tried downloading some of his poetry on the computer, which I did successfully, but it wouldn't burn on my disk, so I was going to bring it, but too bad. But there is a lot there. Often considered his greatest single work, Under Milk Wood, a radio play featuring the characters of Larrigub, is set in a fictional Welsh village. Larrigub is bugger all, spelt backwards, implying that there is absolutely nothing to do there. The BBC credited their producer Stella Hiller with ensuring the play actually materialised. Assigned some of the more wayward characters who were then writing for the BBC, she dragged the notoriously unreliable Thomas out of the pub and back to her office to finish the work. The play took several years to write, and Thomas finally performed Under Milk Wood solo for the first time at Harvard during his first US tour in 1953 in May. In October of that year, Thomas arrived in New York to take part in a performance of Under Milk Wood at the city's prestigious Poetry Center. He was already ill and had a history of blackouts and heart problems, using an inhaler in New York to help his breathing. Thomas had liked to boast of his addiction to drinking, saying, "An alcoholic is someone you don't like, who drinks as much as you do." He liked the taste of whiskey and had a powerful reputation for his drinking. The writer Elizabeth Hardwick recalled how intoxicating a performer he was and how the tension would build before a performance. Would he arrive only to break down on the stage? Would some dismaying scene take place at the faculty party? Would he be offensive, violent, obscene? These were alarming and yet exciting possibilities. His wife Caitlin said in her embittered memoir, "Nobody ever needed encouragement less, and he was drowned in it." Thomas exhibited the excesses and experienced the adulation which nowadays would be associated with rock stars. However, the amount he is supposed to have drunk in his lifetime and in New York before his death on November the 9th may well have been exaggerated as Thomas became mythologized. So after his death, the first rumours to circulate were of a brain hemorrhage, followed by reports that he had been mugged, and soon stories began to fly that he had drunk himself to death. Later there were speculations about drugs and diabetes. At the post-mortem, the pathologist found that the immediate cause of death was swelling of the brain caused by the pneumonia reducing the supply of oxygen. Despite his heavy drinking, his liver showed little signs of cirrhosis. And this was something that was made public in England later, that he was a beer drinker. So although he drank a lot, it was beer. And while he was in New York, he was plied with whiskey, which was not his wont. In Fatal Neglect, Who Killed Dylan Thomas, David N. Thomas refutes the idea that alcoholism contributed to the poet's death. The book suggests Dylan Thomas was the victim of Dr. Feltenstein, who administered morphine for delirium tremens when Thomas in fact had pneumonia. He also suggests that Feltenstein covered his tracks by pressuring other doctors to agree that it was an alcohol-related death. And if you read the details of this, it sounds very much like Michael Jackson and the way the doctor helped him die faster than he should have. He points to John Brunen's culpability as Thomas's agent and suggests Brunen neglected his duty of care. Caitlin Thomas's two autobiographies, Double Drink Story, My Life with Dylan, and Caitlin Thomas, Leftover Life to Kill, both describe the highly destructive effect of alcoholism to the point and to their relationship. Ours was not only a love story, it was also a drink story, she writes. The bar was our altar. Following his death, his body was brought back to Wales for his burial in the village churchyard at Lohen on the 25th of November. Thomas's obituary was written by his longtime friend and Welsh poet Vernon Watkins, and his wife Caitlin died in 1994 and was buried alongside him. And she did write 2 autobiographies about her life with Dylan. And in fact, after he died, she eventually moved to Italy, where she lived with a Italian, he worked in films, he was a director's assistant, and she had one son, Francesco, with him. She lived in Sicily, and funnily enough, my sister also has lived there for many years. And she lives in this little village outside Catania, and she was in the village store one day when they said, "Oh, you speak English? There's a woman in the village that would like a manuscript typed." And so they gave her, they said they took Anne's number, and the woman came over, and of course it was Caitlin Thomas with her last biography. But she didn't have my sister type it. She took it back to England. Anyway, if we have time, I've got a couple of poems. Yes, okay. He's famous for several of his poems are more famous than the others, even though I think they're all beautiful. And this is from one, In My Craft or Sullen Art, from Deaths and Entrances. And it's the last stanza. Not for the proud man apart from the raging moon I write on these spindrift pages, nor for the towering dead with their nightingales and psalms, but for the lovers, their arms round the griefs of the ages, who pay no praise or wages, nor heed my craft or art. And I'll read you the last stanza of Fern Hill, which was one of in his first collection. And this is the one that's looking back at his childhood in the countryside in Wales. Nothing I cared in the lamb-white days, that time would take me up to the swallow-thronged loft by the shadow of my hand, in the moon that is always rising, nor that riding to sleep I should hear him fly with the high fields, and wake to the farm forever fled from the children's land. Oh, I was young and easy in the mercy of his means. Time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. And This one, I'll just read the second stanza from Lie Still, Sleep Be Calmed. Under the mile-off moon we trembled, listening to the sea sound flowing like blood from the loud wound. And when the sea's salt sheet broke in a storm of singing, the voices of all the drowned swam on the wind. And I'm not going to read his most famous villanelle. Do not go gentle in that good night, because I guess you won't know it. I'll just read the last stanza of another of his very famous ones, and death shall have no dominion. And death shall have no dominion. No more may gulls cry at their ears, or waves break loud on the seashores. Where blew a flower, may a flower no more lift its head to the blows of the rain. Though they be mad and dead as nails, heads of the characters hammer through daisies, break in the sun till the sun breaks down, and death shall have no dominion. Thank you.